Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It was a great performance. I've written, in one of my columns, I wrote about how the quest for self-improvement can sometimes be at the risk of self-acceptance, and how it's a very American trait to want to improve ourselves constantly, but sometimes that can lead to the idea that we're never satisfied with ourselves. And Natalia has done a lot of work on this, and we've been talking about it. And I was saying to Natalia, it's interesting, this is a German play, and how we were talking about a little bit, if you could talk a little about how this is such an American thing, wanting to self-improve, and how you think it might have been different if this had been by an American playwright as opposed to a German playwright.
Well, I think it's a really good question, and I think that in some ways, optimism and self-improvement and the idea that you can come from nothing and become anything, from your social status to the way you look, that is very American, right? And I mean, it's embedded in the pursuit of happiness, embedded in our Declaration of Independence, is something that's really endured in the United States, I think, and has now exists in myriad ways. I think that this play, how would it have been different in an American context? I think, well, because that sort of ethos is so embedded in America, I think that the kind of categorical condemnation of this kind of pursuit of self-betterment would not go over so hot, you know, if that was an American project. And now I think, though, that I mean, we have to distinguish, like you and I were talking about as well, between self-betterment and self-improvement in general and cosmetic surgery, because I think that those are two different kind of things. Definitely cosmetic surgery is part of that, right, but not totally.
Right. That's a very good point, though. As we have all seen and we've talked about, cosmetic surgery is one aspect of the idea that we can always make something better. And I think that is something, as I said, we said, is deeply ingrained. And you had said before that it's an idea that can either be, I love this expression, imprisoning or empowering. And this idea that we can constantly self-improve ourselves. And I was wondering, a lot of people blame, or you know, it depends how you look at the self-improvement. Some people think it's a great thing. Like I said, some people think it's imprisoning. And some people think it's a particular part of Western culture. That it's not that we're so much looking to make ourselves better, but marketers are telling us to make ourselves better. You can always look that much better, you can always act that much better, you can always be that much happier. And I'm wondering, how much do you think is this internal and intrinsic part of being human, and how much of this comes from outside of us and the marketing forces that's all around us?
I think that, I mean, I hesitate to talk about universal human traits, but I do think this is not part of it. You can say, okay, this is uniquely Western. I mean, the Protestant work ethic, right, has a lot to do with this idea of keep working, then you'll keep gaining, and that's the, you know, hard work is the way that you get to anything, and that's obviously a Western product. On the other hand, if you think about some of the dimensions of self-improvement culture today, they take very much from Eastern traditions, right? And that is, I mean, if you look, even you mentioned the kind of business dimension of this, and certainly the rise of the happiness industry today is what has made this, I think, such a big part of not just American culture, but the fact that this is even a subject for German playwrights to write about, right? That kind of business has made it much bigger, and that borrows a lot from Eastern culture. I mean, just you could say in a nice way, kind of the widespread nature of things like yoga and meditation in today's culture, or you could say very cynically, as some critics do say, the commercialization of yoga, the fact that you buy $90 yoga pants now to, you know, get Zen, when it was originally a kind of ascetic practice. I think that the business part of it, you say to it, speaks to its widespread nature and why this is resonant in many cultures.
And that's a really good point. And it has, I mean, I think that's the two sides of the self-help industry in a way, is that it's not inherently bad. There's nothing inherently bad about wanting to improve ourselves. On the other hand, when we never can be satisfied, when there's this idea when there's this idea that you sort of saw reflected in the play, that one change, I mean, obviously it's exaggerated the way it's presented in the play, but it's exaggerated to make a point. One change can make our lives so much better, and then make our lives so much worse. And I think this is the sort of the answer everyone's looking for and it doesn't really exist out there.
Yeah, I think that this play, even though it only focused on this, one cosmetic procedure, is really pretty obviously, I think, a critique, for all of these quick fix solutions. I mean, how many magazines do we all see? 10-minute abs, right? Yeah. 7 habits of highly effective people. Just do this. It's always under 10, right?
Yeah.
10 or under. Just do these things, and you too can end up with happiness and abs and all these wonderful things in your life. And I think that this is definitely
happy abs.
Right, happy abs. I mean, look at me, right? I could use that book.
Yeah.
But I think that that's critiqued here through the lens of physical recreation. But I think that exists really in whether it's about get rich quick schemes or get skinny fast. Thin thighs in 30 days was a huge seller when it came out in the 60s. And I think that is that's kind of intrinsic to this whole culture. Do
you think we're going more and more in that direction? I mean, as you said, it's nothing new to the 2000s. It's nothing new to Americans. But do you think that, I mean, it's got to stop at some point. How many self-help books can there be? How many,
Scary question to ask.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm not, as we talked about before in our conversation, I actually do think, like you said, there is plenty that's empowering about the idea that you can better yourself. You can better your station in life. You can actually get happier, and that's great. However, I think exactly what you were saying, it can be very imprisoning to think that, well, if I'm not happy or if I'm not thin or if I'm not rich, it's my fault, right? And that there's something wrong with me, because that dichotomy between what an individual can do and how they're embedded in larger social structures, I mean, that's totally oversimplified, right?
And that's a great point. I mean, that's a great point. And that's something in this column I wrote about. I talked at that point, Occupy Wall Street was a big thing going on. And one of the things that made that such a, sort of revolution in this country was there was a great quote by David Brooks, the New York Times columnist, where he talks about how, let's see if I can find it here. He said, Americans always had a sense that the great opportunities lie just over the horizon in the next valley with the next job or the next big thing. None of us is really poor. We're just pretty rich. And I think by that idea, there's good to that idea, but the negative about that idea is the idea that we don't want to, I think Occupy Wall Street showed the other side of this, we don't want to fight against the rich, let's say, because we're going to be like them one day if we just read the books, do, whatever is necessary, rather than trying to create a different world for all of us. I guess there's something I'm trying to say about self-help that can be very selfish. And
Absolutely.
I'm wondering what and then it counters sort of an idea of a community movement. Do you think that's true?
Absolutely. I think there are 2 really good points in what you brought up. One is about the potential for kind of radical activism and how these sort of individual self-help projects are related to that. And some topic that historians bandy about is why was there never a successful socialist revolution in America? Why did that happen? And it's for exactly the reason that you said, right? Because we have really always had this idea that anyone can be rich, anyone can be better. If anyone can be rich and anyone can be better, do I really want to work on breaking down the capitalist superstructure? Right. If I could be the next beneficiary,
Why do I want
not
to
so
ruin
much.
It? Yeah.
And there are always these polls they do of Americans, do you think, what class do you consider yourself part of? No one really thinks they're working class. People consider themselves, everyone is, 90% of Americans or something like that think they're in the middle class, right? So I think that speaks to exactly what you're saying. And you can call that delusional and a really bad thing, or you can see that as, maybe a good thing optimistically. And then the second part, what's the second part of what you just said? It was such a good point that I wanted
about whether it can be selfish.
Oh, yes, of course. Yeah, well, I think, again, this play really showed the kind of narcissism of these kind of projects, right? The whole last scene, I love me, I love me, I love me, and the total indistinctive, the way that all these faces and identities became indistinct. And I think that's one of the most troubling parts of a lot of self-help regimes of any sort is the kind of navel-gazing dimension about it, right? This is just about me. All I can change in the world is myself, so I don't really care if there are people starving out there, or, and I think that I actually am not so cynical about all self-help things, as we talked about too, but one thing that just, to me, is nails on a chalkboard is when people I hear say oh, I don't like to listen to the news. It's just there's too much unhappy stuff out there. And I'm like, really?
Yeah.
Is that about what self-improvement is? Just like you say, it totally diminishes the sense of community.
That's right. And the sense that I'm just going to work on myself spiritually and ignore the rest of the world. And I think that's something that I guess bothers me often, it doesn't have to be part of the self-help movement, but too often I see it. And I think when we talked about it being a particularly American thing, it's not. I mean, we see this is a German play. There is, I don't know so much in other cultures, but I know that having lived in Europe and all, there tends to be a sense that this is both quaintly cute about Americans and really annoying. This idea that we can always get better.
Perpetual sunniness.
That's right. We can always move up and be better than we were. The other thing we sort of had talked about, though, is what's troubling also a little bit about the self-help. We can move forward, but we're not really going to work hard. That somehow we can make it, but we don't have to really do much. All we have to do is somehow get the spiritual zen or have cosmetic surgery or whatever it may be, you know.
So one of the things that when I first started researching this stuff and I was reading all these primary texts of advice literature from all throughout American history, what I found really remarkable is that there are really great critiques you can make about the work that's come out in all different moments. But if you look at this stuff from the 19th century, in the 19th century, the thing that is like so beats you over the head and seems so unrealistic is all you have to do is work hard. You know, if you've read Horatio Alger stories, you know, like the young man with pluck shall rise up and, you know, eventually be rich. And that is kind of a pipe dream, as we know, for all kinds of reasons. But then if you look at like one of the biggest bestsellers today, The Secret, which I hope maybe you're familiar with, or ads all over the subway, if you read that book and you look at, okay, well, what do you need to do to get rich and happy? You don't need to work at all. All you have to do is like write 100 times.
Where do I get
I
a
want
copy
that
of
house.
that?
Yeah, exactly. I know. As you were saying, it worked for the author, right?
That's right.
She sold like
Apparently,
1 billion
she's a
copies.
billionaire.
But work has fallen out of the picture, and I
Yeah.
think that that is really a problem, you know. And so that I think is a change. I think that they're both problematic messages, but I mean, hard work is not to be scoffed at, and I think
Right.
that for that to fall out of the picture is a problem. And I mean, other people have made really good points about how that ethos really contributed to our whole economic crisis, right? And this goes into religion too. This prosperity gospel, right? God wants you to be rich. God wants you to have that flat screen TV. If you really believe that, and you're reading The Secret and believe you really don't have to work for it,
Right.
get another credit card. You know?
It's yeah. It's very true, and a lot of people have complained that that's a problem with the younger generation, if I dare say that. We're all different generations here, but let's say the ones in school, in middle, high school, elementary school, that they've been told that, you know, all you need to do is believe you'll be a star, and you will be. And they sort of forget the message, oh yeah, and you have to work really hard.
Yeah.
That it's just you'll get the trophies, you'll get the star, and somehow you'll be a success. And then you graduate and suddenly job offers aren't flowing your way, and you realize that I guess we've gotten a little bit away from self-help. But I wonder, how do you think there's a way where I talked at the beginning about, and when I wrote my column about this idea that self-help can come at the risk of self-acceptance. Do you think there's a way of finding a balance between those two?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think that you're right, that, I mean, this play is a good example of it, but if I'm understanding your point correctly, that the idea is that all of this literature telling you you can be better and you can be perfect can really make you cause deep problems of where you are right now,
and insecurity,
right?
The feeling
Exactly.
that I'm not good enough.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and I think that it's particularly you know, there's a lot of work done on this about women and the idea of like at one point, okay, well, if you were going to be successful in the workplace, it was kind of okay that you weren't going to weigh 110 pounds and, you know, look a certain way too. And now we've gotten away from that. Now, can they coexist? I think so. And I think there are kind of self-help projects out there which say, you know, the first step in getting better is, it sounds a little kind of woo-woo, but, you know, love yourself exactly as you are. And from there, you can kind of get better. And starting from a place of self-acceptance rather than from kind of self-flagellation.
Yeah, that's the message. But unfortunately, the message is always accept and then change everything. Mm-hmm. And I think that's, you know, and that's what we saw in the play is, well, he was self-accepting, you know, in this sort of mythical world where no one had ever told him he was grotesquely ugly. And then once he was told that, he was no longer satisfied. And then he had this great, and then everybody wanted, and while the play, you know, completely denigrates this idea that it's awful that everybody wants to look like him. That's almost the message we get in the world a lot. Everybody should look like this you know, this star or that singer. Everybody, you know, the reality is we can't, but really you should want to.
Well, I think looks, again, are a really specific subset of this whole project, and a really hard one, too, because you're born with this physical appearance, and that's something you really don't have control over. It's different than economic class, kind of, right? And it's different than other projects. And so I think when I've read, like, way too much of this kind of literature, but I think the stuff that I find a little bit more compelling than the think it and your whole life will change are like the really manageable things to deal with specific areas of your life. Like I mentioned it with some dismissiveness, the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, but that's effectively a kind of organizational plan for doing better in, you know, professional endeavors in different parts of your life, which is pretty feasible that if you follow those steps, you could move forward. Then there's all the, you know, really focused. It's true. Maybe you can't get thin thighs in 30 days. Probably if you do those exercises, you're probably going to look
just buying the book
better.
Doesn't do it. That's
yeah, exactly. It's the quick fix dimension of it. And it's funny. I wrote something about the way that a subset of this literature deals with people doing graduate work and writing their dissertations, which is, any of you have done that, it's like a very long process. And one of them was like, write your dissertation in 15 minutes a day was the title of the thing. And within 2 pages.
And it'll take you like 20 years?
Yeah, exactly. 2 pages, she's like, I don't really know anyone who's actually done this, but I chose the title, and the idea is that 15 minutes will get you started writing. And, you know, and I think that that's kind of the idea. If any of this stuff provides the spark that gets you moving, then great. But, yeah, all the facile marketing is like...
That's a good point.
Yeah.
And now, we haven't talked, so I don't know if there's an answer to this or if you know of an answer.
Yeah.
Is self-help tend to be... You know, let me say, I think a lot of people I know in sort of elite intellectual classes will never admit to buying a self-help book. I mean, it's like everyone's sort of read or sort of heard, but God forbid, you know, it's always like I read, you know, it at my dentist's office or something. And so I just
behind the magazine.
That's right.
Yeah.
You know, I'm just wondering, do you think, is there a class base to those who are interested in self-help?
It's funny that you phrase it in terms of class based, because I think that yes and no. I think the first part of what you said, absolutely. Lots of people also in my academic circles and kind of people who consider themselves the thinking classes think that this is all kind of pap, and in some ways are right? But the class part is interesting too, because in some ways this whole happiness project, this is the stuff of an affluent society, right? It really takes a certain level of affluence to be able to engage in worrying about your waist or thin thighs. Yeah. So I think that there is a kind of real cynicism among people who consider themselves like too smart for this stuff. But even in those ranks, I mentioned there's a whole body of like dissertation self-help literature, and then there I think it is seeping into that world too. In some ways, much more for better. Like I mentioned, you know, I'm a historian. I got my PhD, everything. And in my other life, I'm actually really into exercise. And I actually teach an exercise class, which uses a lot of these principles in a way I think is empowering. And this was like my dark secret. I'm like, if anyone in academia ever finds out that I do this.
I hate to tell you, it's out now.
Yeah, it's out now. Well, I've been out for a while now. And the funny thing is that I'm sure there's some people who think it's totally crazy, but I've found that there are actually quite a few academics who are like, could I come to your class? You know, but it is in hushed tones, and I think that only exists in certain groups of people.
That's interesting.
Just like you pinpoint.
Before I open up for questions, is there anything you think we haven't taught that you'd like to mention?
You don't want to hear all I have to say on this, but no, I think it really I was when you first contacted me about this, and I said, well, you know, I don't know much about Germany at all, but I think it's actually, I'm really glad that even though I'm a U.S. historian, the German context of this play just really raises the questions about how I think that the commodification of this whole pursuit of happiness has made it a global project, and obviously it's going to look different in different contexts. But it's really interesting to see that, because I don't think Central Europe would have been the place where this would have necessarily been worthy of a play. I don't know, maybe 30 years ago or something.
I think that's a really good point, and I know Raphael has told us that this has been produced in many different languages, which I think that's pretty fascinating.
So is The Secret.
Yeah. Oh, really? The Secret? Oh, well, there you go. Languages. So this definitely is not just an American phenomenon.
For sure not.
Oh, that's interesting. So I'm going to open it up for questions for either of us, both of us, whatever anyone would like to, or any comments also, more than welcome.
Thank you for staying.
Yeah.
How much has the whole self-help movement gotten away from results or where it's all about, for the publishers, it's all about moving product. You don't really care if it's an end spec. And for consumers, it's a palliative of, well, at least I'm doing something. I bought the book. Whether I actually follow any of the advice or not is irrelevant because I've made that step, and so I've tried.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you say that because that actually brings up the bigger question that like the self-help movement or field or industry is so ill-defined because there's very little kind of, I don't want to say professionalism, but they're experts in particular things, but no one's really measuring this stuff, right? So you could imagine when this was operating on a much smaller scale and you had individual kind of teachers and coaches and people that maybe you could measure results, but I don't know. I can't say, oh, it's moved away in a certain way, but I definitely think, what I think your question suggests is that it certainly moved more towards selling the next thing, right? Rather than affecting a worldwide change in anything.
Do you know when the first, I know Dale Carnegie was like in the 30s. When was the first self-help book?
Oh my gosh, well, long before that. Dale Carnegie was in the 30s, but you had Samuel Smiles in the mid-1800s. Yeah, no, Smiles. I think this is his real name too. You could argue that a lot of things are kind of self-help. You could argue that any of the utopian movements of the 19th century in the United States too, where you had all of these kind of groups that, like, starting with like someone like Nathaniel Hawthorne, right, who said, like, forget society, we're going off and we're making our own world. Those are versions of self-help communities
and
too.
And the 12-step.
Yeah, and the 12-step movement.
I know Alcoholics Anonymous also started in the 30s, so that's true.
Well, what's interesting to me about the play was sort of this idea that there was a right face, that there was a correct face, and that it's obvious that he didn't have it, and shocking that he didn't know he didn't have the correct face. And so I'm trying to connect the dots between that, which is what I thought was the most prevalent thing, and so I guess my question for you is what's the connection for you between self-help and feeling like there's a kind of a natural way you're supposed to be, and there's no discussion about it. It's just obvious that this is what you should be, and this is what you should do, and it becomes naturalized.
I think that's a really good point, especially as it pertains to physical appearance. And I think we were talking about the self-esteem movement before, which is exactly the opposite of what this play was saying, right? Where the self-esteem movement, which was a kind of a movement in education, was about telling every kid, like, you are great, you are wonderful, exactly as you are, you're special, which is good in a lot of ways, considering what's going on in schools. Exactly. If we're focused on difference and embracing difference. This is the opposite. And I think that culturally, we think it's sort of more right not to think there are absolute standards of beauty because, one, it threatens a lot of our own sense of selves. But, there's been this research recently. There was a big article in the New York Times Magazine a few months, maybe like a year ago or so, about a researcher, not in my field, studying and saying there actually are all of these absolute standards of beauty, and much like our friend Letta in the play, that they really dictate the way that you are compensated in the workplace and your success in life, really based on how widely spaced your eyes are, how tall you are, things like that, that there really could be a right face for success. And so what was brought up in this article, if I remember it correctly, was saying that, okay, well, we know that not having these features is a disadvantage in the same way that race, gender, all these other things are. What if we had affirmative action for ugly people? Now, in this thing, I really stuck with me because I think, and I'm curious to see what you and any of you think about this, if you are eligible for affirmative action for gender, race, etc., at least we've hopefully come to a place in our society where you kind of feel okay applying for that. Can you imagine a place in our society where you would get in line being like, oh, I'm with the ugly ones. Can I please have my benefits?
And who would make that determination?
Right. Well, you would get it from these studies. Say, well, let me see, your eyes are, okay. You might be eligible. You know what I mean?
Ugly enough.
But I think that that to get back to your question, I don't know, I found that study kind of totally disturbing, right? Because it suggested there really are right standards of beauty for success.
Sort of makes me think that we're going about solving these problems in the
wrong way.
Really.
As opposed to questioning these normative standards.
The category of gender, I was thinking, oh, well, those are totally two different examples because I'm a woman, obviously I have boobs, and that's not how it is. There's way more hermaphrodites than anyone acknowledges. There's way more. And it's it's sort of not even actually that different. If you actually could measure, it's not actually.
Yeah, we raised the question that questioning the categories is probably the right thing to do. Why do we think that thin thighs are so perfect, right? Why is that? And kind of like breaking down those categories rather than saying, let's reshape society to enshrine those people who have a perfect figure.
Interesting.
That's a good question.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Not just in the physical diet kinds of books, we found that the rise of books promoting self-esteem or general improvement, is there a correlation between that rise in popularity and commercialization and the rise in female buying power, do you think?
Oh, for sure. I mean, women as a market segment women are tremendous consumers of this kind of material, and I think that those go hand in hand. You could even say they're mutually reinforcing because they read the books, they become rich, they can buy more books because they work so well. If you believe they work, I'm kind of kidding, but I think yes, absolutely right. As women have more power of the purse, then they can buy more things like this.
I guess what I'm trying to ask
Yeah.
is that this desire or this belief that you can change your surroundings and yourself, do you find that it's a more stereotypically feminine desire, or is it a male desire, or even just to admit or publicly want to change your station in life? Have you found that to be a male thing, not like a stereotypical male quality, or is it a inherently female quality that marketers have learned to take advantage of?
That's a really good question. You know, there's a phrase which I didn't coin called the culture of confession, which brings up like, you know, the Oprah model of talk shows and things, of this culture of going on TV and saying, I was here and now I'm here and now I've gotten better and this is my struggle. And that, lots of scholars have said that is a distinctly kind of female or feminine way of interacting with the world, and I think that culture is distinctly tied to there being a market for this kind of material. And I think that the scene in the play which brought this up, which was minor but really interesting, was when the wife had gone around telling everyone that he'd had an accident because she thought he'd be embarrassed, right? That he'd had that work done. And I think that that there were so many layers there that you can unpack, but I guess Lette was kind of like this oblivious character who's like, why would I be embarrassed? But she, who seemed a little more attuned to what was going on in the world, was like, well, obviously a man would be embarrassed to, you know, reshape himself like this. And whereas I think in our culture, we were talking about earlier, the kind of democratization of plastic surgery has become such that I overheard a conversation recently where someone said to a woman, oh, you look amazing in that top. And she goes, you could too for $7,000, because she had gotten her breast done. And it was like, no embarrassment, nothing. Maybe that's great that there's no embarrassment of this. Maybe it's like totally disturbing that people are chopping themselves up, and you know, and that we have such an open culture of confession. But I think that has at least very much begun as a mode of women's discourse, and I think has probably gotten bigger. Reality to me is something to do with that too. Yeah.
I haven't done this kind of research at all.
Yeah.
It would seem to me it would depend what the subject is. I think men are expected to change within their jobs, let's say. Do you know what I'm saying? I mean, it seems like most of it is more female-oriented, but that men, within a certain framework, men are expected to have aspirations and to change and develop. While women, it's much more about looks and about spirituality to some extent. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
It depends which world we're talking about.
And you know, and this is all, and that was very much the case, I think, up through much of the late 20th century. Then there was, I don't know if anyone remembers, the kind of men's movements of the 1990s, and these were kind of retreat-like self-help movements for men. And the idea was men to get back in touch with their kind of emotionalism, men who had been kind of dehumanized by corporate culture and not been allowed to connect to their, and almost emasculated, but not being able to connect to their masculinity. Almost paradoxically, the answer to that was to express that masculinity in feminine forms of expression, right? Because of that culture of confession being considered feminine. But some of those forms of expression, you could argue, were not ladylike at all, or were perhaps highly misogynistic. But yeah, there was this whole men's movement in the 1990s. Yeah, and like the Promise Keepers were another group like that.
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Yes, sir.
I think we've lost control of the possibility of nurturing and educating our offspring. Now that you can only disappear off to some isolated place and and have very little education and very little, just personal nurturing. But to live in the wider world now is to expose your children to the pressures that are entirely about consumers. And is there any way that can be stopped?
Well, a lot of utopians since about 1820 have thought no and have left. And I think that I wish I had, I mean, with a 1-2-year-old and this one on the way, I wish I had a good answer for that. I do think these pressures of consumerism are in some ways all-consuming and omnipresent. But I don't know if the answer to that is to disconnect from the larger culture entirely, because it might be throwing the proverbial baby out with the bathwater, I think.
I guess I would say, having two kids older in their teens, one of the things, and I've written something about this, is you need to educate them to what they're being sold. You know, and that, I mean, and try to do it without making them completely cynical about the world, but to make them skeptical. And there's a big difference between the two. And sorry, go on.
No, I was just thinking earlier you were talking about the way that Europeans can look at Americans and think, on one hand, they're quaint,
Yeah.
and another way that it can be quite irritating.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the things that perhaps in Europe we instantly think of with Americans is teeth.
These are real. I never had braces.
I did.
Never had braces.
But do you know what it starts that young, and the pressure to actually start changing.
Yeah. No, that's true. And also I think a lot of, having lived in England, a lot of the things about Americans, the naivete, willing to sort of take all this in and sort of swallow it whole in a way. I mean, that's being very generalized, you know. But I think with the consumerist culture, it's here to stay. It's not going to go away. And I think, though, if you educate your kids about what commercials, what marketing, there's a whole movement about media literacy. Thank you.
Yeah.
And to say this is what is being done to you, at least be aware of it.
That's good, something to sell.
Yeah, market that. Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right, and something that we were talking about also before is, so as a historian, you know, the big things, like the big message you're educated in, and what I teach to my students is, you know, that history is not a series of kind of great men and individuals who, you know, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, and if it weren't for Winston Churchill, you know, like, it's not a series of people, but these much larger systems which create very, very big processes. And I think that that's a hugely important development. I, you know, right with embracing those assumptions, but in that, it's really important not to forget that you actually can make change in your life, that hope actually means something, that actually individuals can have impact. And I think that that can be something which in certain circles can be totally left out of the conversation. And that, as a college professor, I work with high school kids in another program that I do, I never want them to lose sight of that. So I don't know, when you were talking about education, which is something I write quite a bit about, I've actually started a program where we go into public high schools, and the idea we do fitness things and food things, and the idea is to get the students asking questions. And so we work in very underserved areas, and for them to even ask not how can I eat better, because there's a whole anti-obesity movement which basically faults people of color for being obese and being lazy and not like knowing enough, but actually asking questions. Why are there no fresh fruit anywhere in my neighborhood, right? What can I do to change that? How can I make slightly healthier choices? So kind of getting back to your question about how can this be empowering, even for like a 14-year-old, right, in the educational system, how can I make it one different choice today? And I think that those are, perhaps it's my American naivete, but you know, I think that like that kind of education can actually be quite good within our consumer culture.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, one thing, we talked about the self-help movement, and I guess we mentioned this, but the important thing is, too often I think the self-help movement, as Natalia had said, is about I just changed myself. I can get thinner. Well, that doesn't take into consideration the marketing aspects of it and the way food is made and sold now. And so if you just focus, and this is why I have problems with reality shows like The Biggest Loser, if you just exercise and diet, apparently you don't have a job because you just do it constantly, then you're going to be thin, and it doesn't take into account genetics, and it doesn't, like I said, marketing. So the self-help movement, if it encompasses a bigger reality than just the individual will change him or herself, I think then it can be helpful.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyone else have thoughts on all this? I think.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you
Thank you
very
for
much
coming.
for staying. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.